Canadian stories aren't always represented on the big screen here in Canada. It's an industry that's been long dominated here by the United States. But director Miranda Depensier is using her lens to tell a uniquely northern story from a tiny Arctic community. The Grizzlies is based on a true story. It follows the story of several Inuit youths in a grieving Nunavut community and what happens when they get a teacher from the south who plans to only stay for a one-year contract.
Welcome to the edge of the world.
We have 21 students in your class.
Miranda Atatahak, Shani Ignak Palgar, sorry. Jason Midovic.
He's not coming back.
Joining me now is Miranda Depensier. She's the director of the Grizzlies. It's her debut feature. Last October, she won the Directors Guild of Canada Award for Best Direction in a Feature Film. And she joins me from Montreal tonight. Miranda, good to see you in the chair.
Hello, good to be here.
Okay, I'm going to tell you a story first of all. So I went to see the movie on the weekend, and we discovered that there were no tickets left. It was sold out. So we had to go to, yeah, right. And so we went to another theater. But you know, the thing is, a lot of people, when I tell that story, say, for a Canadian film, it was sold out. Yeah. So congratulations.
Hey, thanks. No, it's been an incredible ride. It really has. We're in our third week of #1 at the Canadian box office for Canadian film, and so we're excited, and it doesn't look like it's slowing down.
Tell us how you see this story. What is this story about for you?
Oh, it's so many things, and it's become so many things for me. It's honestly hard for me to talk about without bawling my eyes out and
That's okay.
and talking for hours. So I'll try to put it into a soundbite. But I mean, basically, I got attracted to this story because it was an ESPN news piece about a group of kids in a small northern town who were overcoming their trauma through sport. It attracted me because I had suffered from depression in high school, and sports had really helped me. And I love stories about people overcoming difficulties. You know, we all have challenges in life, and I was just moved by these kids. But it really changed and became so much more when I got up to the Arctic for the first time, when I met the real kids who the story's about. I'd never been to an Inuit community. I couldn't believe this was Canada. Born and raised, I'm a city girl from Toronto, and I thought, what the hell have we done? I mean, yes, we know when I first started to work on this story 10 years ago, this country wasn't talking about reconciliation on the scale that they are, and that we are today. And words like, you know, decolonization weren't around the way they are today. So I started out making what I thought was a sports drama, and it's become so much more. Yeah.
How are you, because you referenced this idea in the film as well, but how are you as a Southerner, someone from Toronto, coming to tell this story? How are you welcomed or not welcomed to tell that story? How are you trusted?
Yeah, I mean, so very quickly, I mean, again, I thought I was telling a sports drama. I get to Kugluktuk for the first time. I have to say, the real Grizzlies that I met, the real Miranda Atatahak, the real Adam Kikpak opened themselves to me in a way that was really stunning and beautiful, and I will deeply appreciate it. The fact that they trusted me from the beginning was it was really gutsy of them. And Miranda Atatahak said, you know, I don't know if I want to give you my life rights because we don't know if we want to remember what life was like before the Grizzlies started in this community, the trauma. And the death was the toll was so huge. But if we don't give you our life rights, we could go back there again, and if this movie can help other communities, we want you to have the life rights, and she signed. Yeah. And the real Adam Kikpak said, I was an alcoholic and a drug addict before that lacrosse stick went in my hand, and now I'm going to give it to you. I'm going to give you my life rights. We need to tell this story. And I said, how old was he? I asked him how old he was, and he said he was 13. Wow. So it was profound. I immediately knew that I needed to find Inuit producing partners because I knew nothing about the Arctic and about the culture. And thankfully, I found two incredible partners, Stacey Alec McDonald and Alethea Arnacook-Burrell. And without them, I couldn't have made this movie. Right. It really was a collaboration.
And the actors, right?
Oh, we auditioned 600 kids all over the Arctic Circle. We wanted every kid to have a chance to audition. We trained and mentored Inuit in every single department on the crew. And those 600 kids we auditioned, we did a workshop with 60 of them in the Eastern Arc Shop. in the Eastern Arctic, and we taught them throat singing and drum dancing and a lot of work that they could return to their communities.
So many of these kids were not actors. They were
no. They are amazing though. They were incredible, and a lot of the actors deal with the same issues that the real kids do. So, you know, it was funny, you know, when after I came down to the South, I tried to reach these Inuit producing partners that I was hoping to get on board, and they said, you know, basically somebody said, we don't want any white people come from the South making films about the North. And I said, well, that's who I need to get on board. And I'm really grateful. The collaboration's been extraordinary.
Yeah. What other challenges did you face in making this film?
I mean, this movie had everything for a first-time director. We had stunts, we had dogs, we have sports, we have first-time actors, we had language, we had weather. But really,
you shot in Nunavut and you shot in Toronto.
We shot almost entirely in Nunavut. We shot 3 days in Guelph at the end, but yeah, it was physically a challenge. But it was such a community. It was such a team, and because we'd done the workshops up there, so many locals worked on the movie, and it really became just a big love fest. We had a great time.
Okay. It's not often we see films in Canadian movie theaters that represent our stories. Why is that, do you think?
I mean, I hope it's changing. You know, you look at the rest of the world. I think what's hard about English Canada is we're up against Hollywood. We're up against the behemoth of movie production, and it's in our language, and the culture's got some similarities. So, you know, I think Quebec has an easier ride. You know, they produce incredible film. And I don't mean they have an easier ride in producing great filmmakers, but I mean they have a very specific culture. And a lot of smaller communities in the world who have specific cultures can lean into that. It makes it harder in English Canada because we've got a lot of similarities with the States. But I think that's changing, and the more specific we get with our storytelling, thankfully, the world is getting more diverse. Our storytellers are getting more diverse, you know, not to knock white men, because they've been doing a fabulous job making movies for a very long time. But it's great that there's some other people that are starting to get to the table, and we're giving opportunities to people of color, to Indigenous filmmakers, and to new voices. I think that's where it's going to start getting interesting.
All right. Miranda Depensier, the director of the Grizzlies, which I think is still in theaters this week, Miranda.
Yes,
right?
We're still in theaters. Go now.
Joining me from Montreal, thank you so much for taking time for your busy schedule. I know we pushed you into it. Thank you so much for coming on the show tonight.
Thank you so much. Good night.
Grizzlies is getting a great reputation by word of mouth, made in Canada film by Canadians with a strong Canadian cultural identity. But many commentators say it's an exception. Canadian television, film screens dominated by American shows, some news dominated by American news, as are the bookshelves of most of our bookstores. And tonight we're asking our panel, are we as Canadians losing ourselves to the American identity? Joining me in Toronto to address this question is freelance author and columnist Michael Coren, author and journalist Stephen Marsh, and from Calgary, North Weather Vice President of Strategy, Zane Velji. All right, Stephen, your inaugural visit to our panel, so let me start with you. How would you describe our relationship to American culture? Are we losing ourselves to the Americans?
Well, losing ourselves seems to imply that it's something new, and this is something we've faced really since, since the War of Independence and since the War of 1812. Northrop Frye once said that, you know, a Canadian is an American who rejects the Revolution, and I think it's very interesting that what distinguishes us is the qualifier. Like, our culture is American, except it's not. It's American, but different. And, you know, so we've always been defined against America and by that through America.
So in other words, we're already losing that battle?
We lost. I mean, we like, certainly in film we lost. Yeah. We lost long ago in film. I mean, you know, I think in film the amount of Canadian viewership of Canadian movies is, you know, negligible. It really barely counts. However, you know, we've at the same time produced all these, you know, actors who, like Jim Carrey, who are I would say, kind of distinctly Canadian, but in an American context. So for us, it's a bit more fluid. And I think that's inherent to who we are and to the very nature of Canadian identity, which is not as strong as in other countries. You know, we have a prime minister who describes us as a post-nationalist nation. And, you know, I think to have your own ferocious mass culture in those conditions is almost impossible.
All right, Zane, what do you think?
Well, first off, Carol, need I say more? I am wearing my Canadian tuxedo, so I will be the Canadian nationalist, so to speak, on the panel.
I don't even have to look down at the monitor to see that. I know what you're talking about.
There you go, exactly. And therein is my point, which is to say, I think it's a little premature to say we've lost this identity battle, so to speak. If I'm looking at Canada versus the USA today, I'm sitting relatively comfortable in terms of the question, which country is facing an identity crisis? Right now, the United States, and largely defined by its political terms, I'll grant you that, is certainly facing a question as to who it is and what it is. And I think it's kind of cynical to say that our identity is only a foil. Yes, there's a small minority of people in this country that see us as a foil to the United States, but I think there are things in this country that are part of our culture and identity that are unique. Are those values unique? Possibly not, but I'd say the depth of commitment and their prioritization, multiculturalism being one of them, I think is inherently unique, and I think it has produced itself in the media that we've produced in this country and that we are seeing significant appetite for beyond the four walls of Canada.
All right, let me go to Michael on this question. Michael, do you think that we are losing or have indeed lost ourselves to the American identity?
Well, in terms of movies, you mean? Well, look, this is not a problem.
Not just movies.
Well,
you can extend it out.
It's not confined to Canada. I mean, any argument about American influence has to be an international one. Travel throughout the world, and I know you have, and everywhere you go, you will find Americanization, which we either see as a problem or as a bonus. I think it's a bit of both, actually. I spent the first 28 years of my life in the UK. Now, you think of Britain with, in terms of entertainment, for example, a vibrant culture. Look at Downton Abbey. Do you really think Downton Abbey was a picture of British life at a certain period? It was made largely, in fact, for an American audience. In the early 80s, I worked for Colin Welland, who was a screenwriter, and he won the Oscar for a movie called Chariots of Fire. Now, I was very, very, very junior, but the effort involved in that to tell a story of two unknown British athletes, it became a big movie. But that was incredibly rare, even for British culture. Scandinavian movies, the noir of Norway and Denmark and Sweden. Well, if you look at the viewing figures, American shows do far better in those countries than the Scandinavian shows do. We have an added problem. We have an added problem because we have a border with the United States. We sound like Americans, so when we do well, we're thought of as being American. This is just what you hear New Zealanders say, by the way. When they do well, they're thought to be Australian. Gough Whitlam, speaking of Australia, huge investment into movies. That might achieve something, but otherwise, no, it's a battle we can't really win.
Can't win, Zane.
Michael just stole my last point, so we were simpatico on that, which is ultimately, because we share the border, we actually can never compete in our own lane. Everything we do has to be measured to our neighbors down south, right? If we were off the island of Western Europe, you know, we would be considered quite a unique culture because we wouldn't be constantly tethered, constantly compared to our network, you know, production standards.
Compared by who?
Compared internally by media criticism, largely by ourselves, I would say true, but also compared from like a raw output format, right? We're 1/10 the size, so both in quantity, our arguable, more subjective quality, but a large internal criticism to say, oh, you know, we're happy, we're comfortable, we're secure with our place in the world. We always have this natural inclination to look down south and be like, bigger budgets, bigger production standards, bigger movie stars.
Well, but I don't think that explains. I don't think that explains exactly why we're so bad at this. I mean, Iceland, which is a country.
By the way, I don't think I'm saying we're bad.
I think we're quite. I mean, compared to for our size, like England's only 80 million people, and it produces a huge array of vast cultural output that's incredible. I mean, Denmark's 6 million people. Israel's 7 million people. They produce unbelievable television shows. Iceland, a nation of 300,000 people, has produced a better crime drama than has ever been produced in Canada. And so what we face is actually something both very specific, but also kind of inexplicable. Like it is a crisis within ourselves, because it's not that we lack the talent. It's just that if you have a talent here, you can only measure yourself against America.
So does it mean that we have an inferiority complex?
Well, I would say it's a superiority complex.
Okay, one at a time. Michael, what do you think?
Well, it does to an extent, but if I can just comment on television production, Israeli TV, for example, that I know fairly well, if you watch a lot of Israeli TV that isn't exported, it's horrible.
Right,
it's incredibly bad.
That's true.
And when it does well, then it's made into an American version, Homeland being the greatest example
But the
of that.
the United States also does a lot of TV that's horribly bad.
Yes, it does. Look, I don't want to tread on toes here. I have some problems with some of the Canadian TV shows. I'm not going to name any, for goodness sake. I'm too close to home here. But
come on. We won't stop you on the way out.
I don't find Canadian detective shows set in the early part of the 20th century particularly inspiring, but many people do. There's a show in the UK called Line of Duty, which the final episode last week got 12 million viewers.
Right.
That has become essentially an American show for the past 2 seasons. The degree of violence, the way the police work, it's not British at all. It's been very Americanized. So everyone's playing into that game. Do we have an inferiority complex? We do underproduce. In terms of movies, as was mentioned earlier, there are Scandinavian countries with a tiny population that produce more than we do. But we are looking, if anything, to move in a more conservative political direction. If that happens, there won't be investment. We would have to invest a lot of money into our movie industry if we want to even think of competing.
Well, is it about money, though, or is it about getting the story?
It's certainly not about the government's money.
Okay.
I mean, I think one thing is that we have, like, we talk about our inferiority complex towards America, but what we actually have is a superiority complex, where we feel superior to them. We feel if you're going to make Canadian art rather than make it in America, you make it virtuous. You make it by committees of people who decide whether art is actually valid in a political sense. Whereas in America, what they decide is, are people going to like this? And that's how they get mass culture. And you know, so I think what we have here is in fact not an inferiority complex, but in some ways we feel like we're better than them, and because we're better than them, we make art that nobody wants.
Right, or I've noticed something perhaps that people are saying, okay, we want to do something that people like American shows, so let's tell our Canadian stories through an American lens, if you will. Zane, what do you think?
I mean, I think the modern sitcom format has been adopted and initially utilized poorly. But let me give you an example of 2 shows airing on the CBC. Yes, I am trying to curry favor. Kim's Convenience and Schitt's Creek. 10 years ago, if you were to tell me that these 2 shows would have found an audience in the United States, I would have said it's impossible. But because of the advent of the same technology that we could be victimized to, streaming, which is why we consume so much American media in many cases, these shows have been local productions put out there as Canadian stories and have had massive audiences in the United States. And Kim's Convenience particularly, I find a very unique sort of case study, because here in Canada it was released as a show that, yes, had an all-Asian cast, but when it got released in the United States, that's all anyone wanted to talk about, was the fact that this is the centerpiece of the show. How did Canada do this? Why were they able to do this? And I think that in its own right kind of encapsulates the identity conversation for me, which is here in Canada we're almost, I wouldn't say sophisticated about how we deal with some of these issues, which was this is just another Canadian story. But in the US, everything gets advertised and marketed as a sledgehammer. So I feel like we're good at telling our story. We may not be great at marketing our story in a good.
Oh, we lost Zane, but Michael, let me ask you, because I see you're ready to jump in on that. What do you think? What do you think?
I think that was an example of what was said earlier about feeling superior. Yes, I agree there are some wonderful shows made here, but a lot of American TV is extraordinary. I mean, yes, some of the commercial stuff is garbage, but some of the TV they're producing is extraordinary. And the idea that we are more sensitive to issues than they are is simply untrue.
Well, can we say that that some of the Canadian stuff we're doing is extraordinary?
Yes, and well, Handmaid's Tale, this is something was an international hit, written by a Canadian, produced, made in Canada.
Only Americans would have made it. I mean, you know, it could only have been made.
It was shot at the University of Toronto. I would walk past the film in most days.
You know, I often think this, because I'm from Alberta, like, you know, and I love the Alberta landscape so much that when you go to films, Hollywood films, you see it everywhere. You saw it in Superman, you saw it in The Revenant, you see this beautiful, this landscape of Alberta, which is maybe the most filmic landscape that there is, which is why Hollywood keeps going back there. But no one has ever really told a great filmic story about Alberta, even though it has great writers and even though it has great stories. And you know, that's actually a loss to the world.
Yeah. And we're rich with stories here. We have many stories throughout this country.
And I think we're dooming ourselves to be the background because we insist on finding stories that are so good for us. And we insist on seeing art as something small and virtuous rather than big and delicious.
But what about the Grizzlies film? I mean, that seems to be resonating with people.
Well, I haven't seen it, but it was the #1 film for Canadians, Canadian film in Canada, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, I wonder what percentage of the country saw that.
Yeah.
I mean, I assume it was somewhat smaller than the Avengers movie.
Yeah,
I'm just guessing,
assuming.
but but you know, like that it was probably somewhere in the 1/100. Not that there's anything wrong with it, but it 1/100th of the viewers of Avengers.
But let me add this in though. You know, that gets back to what people have said to me. A Canadian film sold out a theater. What?
Well, how many theaters?
That's the idea.
There is something, I mean, it's not just, it's beyond virtue. You can make a quality movie that happens to be virtuous. You can make a virtuous movie that happens to be bad. Now, when it comes to Indigenous stories, yes, they have to be told, but I do believe that all stories have to be told, and there is so much of a history. American history is not particularly old. It's not particularly ancient. Britain can go to so many mythologies and histories. There are stories that can be told here. We simply, I can't quantify it. I can't define why we haven't done it particularly well, and we haven't. We have underproduced.
All right, Zane, last word to you, because you disappeared on us for a while.
Yeah, listen, I think we're in a situation right now where Canada is in a unique position. Co-productions are higher than before. Our demand for artists from this country are higher than before. The other element of this conversation is not just our internal demand for our own content, but is the world wanting our content? And we're at a peak of that right now. We've got Lily Singh, Canadian YouTuber, going to be hosting a late-night network show. We're in groundbreaking territory for Canadians, you know, taking our DNA and our culture and exporting it across the border.
What's the answer? What's the answer, Zane? What do you think the answer is to this issue? Is it the Netflix? Is it the streaming? Is it the global marketplace for television?
I think those are all actually good things, right? Like, as much as that might bring content from a U.S. production house into my, you know, living room, it also gives the same equal level playing field for good Canadian content to find a home across the world. So we can either face that, you know, that as a challenge to say, oh no, more American content's going to be finding our collective living rooms, or we could use it and say some of the great Canadian content that could never find a home, that wouldn't have found a home 15 years ago, now has access to that same marketplace to actually promote that content across the world. I think net we have to, you know, take this in as a positive and frankly leverage some of the great quality that we have in this country.
We have just about 30 seconds left, Stephen. I'm going to actually give you the last word. Tell me, what do you think? What do you think the answer is to this issue?
Oh, I don't think there is any answer. I mean, the answer is to make masterpieces. And,
yeah,
you know,
if only.
Yeah, well, I would say the answer to that really is not, like, I think one of the tendencies of this country is to think, oh, there must be a government solution to this, right? There must be some like collective action that we can take. But like what artists need in this country are not grants. They need an audience. They need people who want to go and see Canadian movies. And, you know, that just isn't in existence right now.
All right, Stephen Marsh, Michael Koren, and Zane Velji, thank you all for talking about this evening. Great discussion.
Pleasure.
Thanks, Carol.